and welcome to this online tutorial. To help me, I'll be using this set of notes, which can be freely downloaded from www.flippinghistory.net. I hope if you enjoy this tutorial that you'll be able to subscribe by clicking on the watermark below. Okay, let's get started. A series of gruesome murders took place in the East End of London between August to November 1888 by a serial killer who has become known to the world as Jack the Ripper. Madame Tussauds waxworks do not include him in its Chamber of Horrors because nobody has ever figured out who committed these murders. Instead, they simply have a shadow in his place. More than 100 suspects have been named by Ripperologists, the word given to people who study this murderer, over the years, and today we'll be deciding who we think was responsible and supporting our claim with evidence. First though, we need some background information. Well, there were 11 separate murders recorded in the police file known as the Whitechapel Murders. But it is widely believed that only 5 of these, known as the Canonical 5, were the work of a single killer due to the striking similarities in the way they were killed. And these people were Mary Ann or Polly Nichols, Dark Annie Chapman, Long Liz Elizabeth Stride, Catherine or Kate Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Ann Nichols' body was discovered at about 3:40 a.m. on Friday the 31st of August 1888 in Bucks Row, Whitechapel. The throat was severed by 2 cuts and the lower part of the abdomen was partly ripped open by a deep, jagged wound. There were several other incisions on the abdomen. Annie Chapman's body was discovered at about 6 a.m. on Saturday the 8th of September 1888 near a doorway in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, Spitalfields. The throat was again severed by 2 cuts and the abdomen was slashed entirely open. The uterus had been removed, and at the inquest one witness reported seeing her with a dark-haired man of shabby genteel appearance at about 5:30 a.m. Next came what is known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were both killed in the early morning of Sunday the 30th of September 1888. Stride's body was found at about 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street in Whitechapel. The cause of death was one clear-cut incision which severed the main artery on the left side of the neck. The body was not mutilated, and many people believe this means the killer may have been interrupted during this attack. Witnesses had seen her earlier but gave contrasting statements of the person she was with. Some said she was with a fair man, others dark. Some said he was shabby, others said he was well dressed. Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square in the City of London just 3/4 of an hour after Stride's. The throat was again severed and the abdomen cut open. The left kidney and most of the uterus had been removed, and part of Eddowes' bloodied apron was found at the entrance to a building in Goulston Street, Whitechapel. Above this, graffiti on the wall blamed Jews, but this was quickly rubbed away by police before it could be photographed. The last of the Canonical 5 murders was Mary Jane Kelly, and she was discovered lying on a bed in a single room where she lived at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street, Spitalfields, at 10:45 a.m. on Friday the 9th of November 1888. Her throat had been severed down to the spine, the abdomen almost emptied of its organs including the heart, and her face was lacerated beyond recognition. Over 2,000 people were interviewed, over 300 investigated, and 80 people detained by the police. The police were desperate to solve this series of crimes, and yet the Ripper was never caught. So, Before we review the evidence, let's consider some of the key suspects. First, we have Montague John Druitt. He was a barrister and a part-time teacher. He came from Dorset but lived in Blackheath on the other side of London. Both his mother and grandmother had suffered from psychiatric illness, and the timing of his death coincided with the end of the murders. Next we have George Chapman, whose real name was Severin Klosowski. He was a barber from Poland but who lived in Whitechapel, and he moved there shortly before the murders began. He was hanged for murder in 1903 because he poisoned 3 of his wives. As a barber, he would be skilled with a blade. Thirdly, we have Aaron Kosminski. He was a hairdresser from Poland who lived in Whitechapel. He was Jewish and was admitted to Coney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in 1891. He never admitted to being the killer, though, and many think a psychopath would have done so. Next up we have John Pizer, a Polish bootmaker who lived in Whitechapel. He was a brutal man who had the nickname Leather Apron, and he had an earlier conviction for a stabbing offence. He was a local Jewish man who was arrested on the 10th of September after the first of the 2 canonical murders, but provided alibis for both of these. He was strong and skilled with a blade and had a reputation as a bit of a local thug. Next up we have Francis Tumblety. He was a doctor and an Irish-born American who lodged in Whitechapel. He hated women and was connected with the death of one of his patients. Next up we have Walter Sickert. Now Sickert was an artist. He was German-born with British and Danish ancestry, but was in France at the time of the murders. He did, however, have a fascination with the Ripper murders, and in some of his paintings he depicted very similar scenes. Next up we have Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence and Avondale. He was a member of the royal family who resided in Sandringham, the Queen's Norfolk residence, and there were rumours that he had been driven mad by syphilis. The week after he died, his son reported that he burned his father's papers, and no good reason was ever given for this. The next person that we'll talk about is Carl Fagenbaum. He was a merchant seaman from Germany but visiting London. In 1894 in New York City, he was arrested for cutting the throat of Mrs. Juliana Hoffman. He had a hatred of women and a desire to kill and mutilate, and although there is no evidence showing he was in London at the times of his murder, William Sanford Lawton, his lawyer, believed he was Jack the Ripper. Lastly, we'll consider James Maybrick. He was a cotton merchant who died in 1889, and a diary which was thought to be Maybrick's was published in the 1990s containing a confession to the murders. So, now that we've got our background information and we know a little bit about some of the key suspects, let's review some of the evidence. Evidence A. The killer's apparent ability to disappear immediately after the killings suggests a local knowledge of the Whitechapel neighbourhood, including its back alleys, narrow streets and hiding places. So the speed at which he escaped points the finger at local suspects like Kosminski, Pizer and Levy. Secondly, Chapman had her uterus removed and Eddowes was missing a kidney. Kelly was almost completely missing her internal organs, including her heart. This suggests someone with a good working knowledge of anatomy, like a doctor or a butcher. So this might implicate medical suspects like Tumblety, Levy, Cream and Gull. Although there were less educated murderers who also had shown evidence of mutilations. Indeed, the coroner's report after the death of Nichols states, "The injuries have been made by someone who had a lot of medical skill and knowledge. There are no meaningless cuts. No unskilled person could have known where to find the organs. No slaughterer of animals could have carried out these operations. And so this evidence suggests, well, maybe it's only those with a medical background, such as Tumblety or Gull. Thirdly, police surgeon Thomas Bond concluded that the throats had been cut from left to right. If the attacks took place from behind, this would suggest the killer was right-handed. If the attacks took place face-on, this would suggest the killer was left-handed. Now, there are arguments for both versions, but the fact that Dr. Blackwell reported Stride's corpse expression was quite calm favours a surprise attack from behind, someone who was right-handed. Next, we should consider that Nichols was killed on Friday morning, Chapman Saturday morning, Stride and Eddowes Sunday morning, and Kelly on Friday morning. So the killer may have been someone who had a job during the week, such as Maybrick, and indeed everyone apart from Hutchinson, Prince Albert Victor, and those in various asylums. Or perhaps it suggests that the Ripper was simply visiting London on weekends, like seamen such as Carl Fagenbaum. After all, many boats visited London from mainland Europe. Also, the murders took place within a few streets of each other. Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, Duckfield's Yard, Mitre Square and Miller's Court, and this suggests the killer probably knew the area very well. So again, that might suggest local suspects like Kosminski or Pizer, or even Levy. Next up, at the inquest of Annie Chapman, one witness reported seeing her with a dark-haired man of shabby, genteel appearance at about 5:30 a.m. Genteel means someone from a wealthy background, perhaps even an aristocrat, and so this might suggest a wealthy killer, such as Gull, or Prince Albert Victor, or Sickert. The witness's name was Elizabeth Long, and she said, "He was dark and wearing a deerstalker hat. I think he was wearing a dark coat, but I cannot be sure. He was a man over 40 as far as I could tell. He seemed to be a little taller than the deceased. He looked to me like a foreigner." The next piece of evidence we'll consider is that the murderer worked with real speed. There was only half an hour between the last sighting of Chapman and the discovery of her body, and moreover, on the night of the double event, the two bodies were discovered within 45 minutes of one another, and by the time Dr. Blackwell examined Stride's corpse, the body was still warm. So to do this so speedily suggests someone who was very strong and skillful with a knife, like a furniture upholsterer, a butcher or a doctor, such as Pizer, Levy, or any of the medical suspects except the elderly. The Times newspaper wrote after the Kelly murder, "Not a trace is left of the murderer, and there is no purpose in the crime to give any clue." Also, we should consider that the double event suggested the killer had a lust for blood. In other words, having been interrupted once, he still had the need to kill, and so it wasn't premeditated. And this suggests that he was psychotic and a risk taker, the kind of person who would end up in an asylum, such as Druitt, for example. An East End newspaper described the killings as the work of a demented being. Moreover, part of a bloody leather apron was found after the murder of Eddowes in front of a building on Goulston Street, Whitechapel. This might suggest he was careless at times, if indeed it belonged to one of the victims. Bootmakers such as John Pizer might have worn such clothing. Many letters were sent to the police, most of which were hoaxes. One letter was also sent to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee and included half a human kidney with the claim that the other half had been fried and eaten. This behaviour suggests a psychopath and a risk-taker who enjoyed fame and his growing celebrity status, such as all the people who were in an asylum. But it also suggests he was literate, which would rule out those who couldn't write and knew how to use the postal system. There was writing on a wall where the bloodied leather apron was found on Goulston Street, which read, the Jews, Jews, are not the men that will be blamed for nothing. Now, this was rubbed off by police to help avoid racial tension, but if it was written by the Ripper, it might suggest that he was Jewish, such as Kosminski, Pizer or Levy, but the spelling error in the word Jews might suggest he was not literate, which would rule out the doctors and barristers, or a non-native speaker of English. Our final piece of evidence is that 4 of the canonical 5 murders took place outdoors, and this suggests he was a risk taker, because it increased his chances of being caught in a busy city like London. It might also suggest he did not have lodgings in London, which might tell us that he was only visiting, such as Druitt, Sickert, Prince Albert Victor and Carl Feigenbaum. So, having talked through the background of the murders and some of the key characters, as well as the evidence, where does that leave us? Well, ultimately, nobody knows for sure who the Ripper was, but for me, it's hard to look beyond the key suspects listed here. I wonder if you can review the evidence and come up with your own judgment. Okay, thank you for listening, and if you'd like to know more, you can find a free, fully resourced 4-part lesson on this question at www.flippinghistory.net.